All right, today we're going to be breaking down the Harlem Renaissance essay. Let's begin. The Harlem Renaissance began in the Harlem neighborhood of New York during the 1920s, which was a part of a period called the Roaring Twenties. The Harlem Renaissance was also known as the New Negro Movement, named after Alan Locke's 1925 anthology series. The New Negro, Harlem became the black cultural mecca of the early 20th century because of the Great Migration that saw many large numbers of African Americans migrate from south to north. By 1920, there was nearly 500,000 African Americans that had migrated to the north, became one of the most populated areas. Due to the large African American presence in the north, a Black Pride movement followed, which resulted in intellectual, social, artistic explosion. Literature, theater, and music manifested during this era. The Harlem Renaissance was a golden age of African American culture that lasted from the 1910s to 1930s. Harlem Renaissance History.com 2009. Many inspirational figures spurred out of this movement, such as Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, Doug Dubois, Marcus Garvey. The other central figure of the Harlem Renaissance was a poet named Claude McKay. McKay has wrote several poems that connect the Harlem Renaissance. The poems that I'll be breaking down are The Harlem Dancer and The Lynching. Each poem has its own significance and their connection to the Harlem Renaissance. Perhaps the most significant poem that Claude McKay has written is The Lynching. This is the sonnet style poem that was published in 1922 during the Harlem Renaissance movement. This poem is directed at lynching going on in the United States and effects it had in the civil rights era. The target audience of this poem is African Americans, civil rights activists, and anti-lynching movements. We know that a lynching does take place in the poem. It does reference several elements that go along with lynching. First, on lines through 9, it quotes, hung pitifully over the swinging char. Day dawned, soon the mixed crowds came to view the ghastly bodies swing in the sun. McKay, The Lynching, 1922, lines 8 through 9. This quote does along with the characteristics of lynching. Lynching is where an individual is killed by a group, and then their deceased corpse is usually hung from a high suspended object, such as a tree, where the body is displayed publicly. This type of execution is mainly used for humiliation and punishment. On line 10, the quote, the ghastly body swinging in the sun sticks out to me. McKay, Lynching, 1922, line 10. McKay uses the word ghastly to describe in vivid detail on how the body is being hanged. Ghastly is an adjective term, means frightful or to cause fear. By using this word, McKay can communicate to the audience on the condition of the body and the people's reaction to the lynching. Line 9 also mentions crowd coming to view the lynching. From the information it gives given in lines 8 through 10, the reader can infer that a horrifying lynching is taking place, but McKay doesn't really explain who is getting lynched. When I first read those lines, they gave me a civil rights movement vibe. In that era were several lynchings that occurred. One example is Jesse Washington. He was a 17-year-old African-American male who was confessed and pled guilty to killing his employer's wife, in which both of them were white. A mob later came and dragged Washington out of the courtroom. When they were hung him up to a tree, they cut off his limbs, and lastly, he was burned alive. This lynching happened on May 15th, 1916, a few years before McKay published the lynching. Another notable lynching victim was Emmett Till. Emmett Till was a 14-year-old African-American who was abducted from his uncle's home and brutally murdered by two white males in 1955. His lynching was not public, but his heavily decomposed body was put on public display in open casket funeral. His mother made a decision to show people what kinds of problems African Americans faced in the South. Emmett Till became the starting point of the civil rights movement. And what is odd is that Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech took place on the same date of Emmett's death 8 years later, on August 28th, 1963. The lynching also has a religious meaning to it as well. The first two lines of the poem state, his spirit is smoke sent to the high heaven, his father by the cruelest way of pain. McKay, The Lynching, 1922, lines 1 through 2. This can be interpreted as the reference to the crucifixion of Jesus. Jesus was brutally beaten and crucified on a cross. His crucifixion was held in public, so in modern terms, Jesus was lynched. The meaning of the quote is Jesus' resurrection to heaven following his crucifixion. Religion was a major part of African American society and in the Harlem Renaissance. The neighborhood of Harlem was rooted in gospel music, which was dated back to the 17th century. I think McKay wrote the lynching because of his knowledge of the lynchings that happened prior to when he wrote the poem, or he was trying to mix together his cultural experiences with race and religion. A History of Gospel Music in Harlem, My Trip to New York by Harlem Spirituals, harlemspirituals.com, 2019. The Harlem Dancer does make connections to Harlem Renaissance. The first connection is that the poem makes in its title. The first word of the title is Harlem, and right away it tells readers what type of setting the story is set in it. Harlem Renaissance, the Renaissance was one of the most crowded areas in the North. Even though the city was going through cultural changes, it did experience several challenges. One of those challenges was the Red Summer 2019, a race riot that broke out in 25 major African American cities. Chicago got the bulk of it in 1919. An African American drowned at a whites only beach. Police failed to apprehend the white perpetrators, which led to riots breaking late July of that year. The violence lasted a week, and with hundreds of people injured and 38 people killed, Washington, D.C. experienced their share of riots when 15 people were killed. The riots then made its way to New York. New York saw increasing rates of racial tension and violent incidents. One incident occurred when a white man and an African American man were arguing about World War I. The African American pulled a gun on the white man, and several bullets hit a few bystanders. A race riot broke in Syracuse a few days later. The neighborhood of Harlem had high rates of violence and crime. Pubevac, Chicago's Red Summer 2019. Women were severely affected by these riots, with many of their employment opportunities being terminated. Black women were victims of racism, and their economic opportunities were limited due to limited sexual stereotypes and perceived limited intellectual abilities. Brack's Black Women of the Harlem Renaissance Era, 2014. Harlem Dancer connects to this with its first two lines. Applauding youths laughed with young prostitutes and watched her perfect half both body sway. McKay, the Harlem Dancer, 1922, lines 1 through 2. This quote is referring to an exotic dancer who works in adult entertainment. She sings and dances with many people attract her abilities. McKay gives the female detailed characteristics, like in line where it quotes, upon her swarthy neck black, shiny curls. McKay, the Harlem Dancer, 1922, line 9. From the quote, I can infer that the woman has curly hair and a swarthy neck. The definition of swarthy is dark skin, so I can assume that the female African American. She sang and danced ungracefully and calm is said on line 5, which can mean the dancer knows how to swing and dance, could possibly have interest in singing career. McKay, Harlem Dancer, 1922, line 5. The last two lines of the poem catch my attention where it states, but looking at her falsely smiling face, I knew herself was not in a strange place. McKay, the Harlem Dancer, 1922, line 13 through 14. This quote tells me that the female wants to do something important with her life, but her opportunities are because of restraints placed on women. Harlem Renaissance. 90% of Black women in the civil rights movement were involved in some type of domestic work and were depicted as uneducated and submissive. Claude McKay connects his poem to social roles of women in the Renaissance. This uses this as a calling card for women to challenge social norm. The end of the Harlem Renaissance did see several women rise to success. Brack's Black Women of the Harlem Renaissance Era, 2014. Both poems have a connection to Harlem Renaissance and African American experience. Each poem is significant in their own way and expresses McKay's views on race, society, and literature. The Harlem Dancer has focused on social roles during the Renaissance, and the lynching has more of a focus on pressures African Americans faced in the civil rights era. This is the works cited page. This is my Harlem Renaissance essay that I wrote. It has a connection to the Harlem Renaissance and it ties into the crucifixion of Jesus. This is one of my probably toughest poems, and the toughest essays, and probably one of my favorite essays as well. See you guys later for more videos.